In this lesson, we'll be discussing shadows. If you'd like to follow along, go under your File menu to Open, and in the Working Files folder, go into Chapter number 14 and select Adding Transparent Shadows and just click Open. Why don't we start by selecting this top object with the word shadow in it. And first, we're going to apply a drop shadow to the object itself. So I'm going to click on the object listing in the effects panel, go under my FX pop-up and choose drop shadow. And you can see it is actually adding a drop shadow to the entire object. Why don't we go through the settings? As I had mentioned, the blending mode of drop shadow is multiply, because it will take whatever is underneath it and make it darker. The opacity by default is 75%. So at its darkest, the shadow is 75% opaque and it blends out over a distance to totally transparent. So the way you control how dark a shadow is change its opacity. So if I were to go down to, let's say 50%, it's going to be a lot lighter. Now, position is the position of the shadow as compared to the original object. And there's two different ways to control the position. One is using an XY offset, which has always existed in InDesign. But when effects became more popular in InDesign, the Photoshop way of positioning effects came in along with the rest of the Photoshop effects. So it's two different ways of doing exactly the same thing, offsetting the shadow from the original object. I'm going to use the distance and angle approach to drop shadows. If I increase the distance, watch what happens. When I click my up arrow, it is going further and further away from the object. It's offsetting it further at a certain angle. If I change the angle by clicking on the angle icon, you can see that I'm actually moving the lighting source. And if I go down into the options section, size is the width from the darkest part of the shadow when it starts to become even more transparent, and it goes all the way out to totally transparent. So increasing the size makes the shadow more and more diffused. And you can see how much more diffused that is now. Spread is the opposite of choke. They both do the same thing in opposite directions. Spread will move the darkest part of the shadow further out, so you can see more of the darkest part of the shadow. Watch what happens when I click on spread and start to drag the scrubby slider. The darkest part of the shadow is moving further and further out. I'm going to get rid of the spread, go back down to 0. Last is noise. Noise, as mentioned in a previous lesson, adds texture. And to make the shadow look a little bit more realistic and less computer generated, I'm always going to add a little bit of noise, probably 4, 5, or 6%. And then just click OK. Now, what if I wanted to apply the shadow to the type? Well, selecting the type doesn't work. Let me show you. If I go to my type tool and I click and drag across the type, everything in the effects panel is grayed out. I have to be selecting the object itself. To select the text as what I'm going to apply the shadow to, I can click on text, the text listing in the effects panel. So now if I go to my FX pop-up and go to drop shadow, you're going to see that it's applying the shadow to the type. And why don't we just run through this? Maybe I'll make the opacity 50%. The distance, I'm going to increase that just a little bit. One click. And maybe what I'll do with the size is I'll make it more diffuse. So I'm going to click the up arrow a couple of times. And I'll add some noise. Once again, somewhere between 4 and 6 or 7%. And I'm going to click OK. There is another kind of shadow. It's called an inner shadow. I'm going to select the object and then click on the text listing to apply an inner shadow to just the text. I'm going to go to my FX pop-up and choose inner shadow. And you can see without even changing the settings at all, it's really a cool feature. It almost looks like the lettering is cut out. The shadow is being thrown from the red object onto a white background beneath it. But why don't we go through the settings? You're going to see the settings are almost exactly the same as regular shadow, a drop shadow. I'm going to decrease the opacity. How about down to 40%? So it's a lot lighter. I'm going to increase the distance a little bit. So it's moving the shadow more out into the lettering at this angle and this distance. I can control the offset either with distance and angle or offset. They both work. If I change one, it's going to change the other. The size. If I increase that, the inner shadow is going to be more diffused. And I'm also going to add a little bit of noise. How about 5%? And here you'll notice that instead of spread, it's choke. The reason why it's choke is because anytime the effect is on the inside of the object, you choke it further in. If it's on the outside of an object, you spread it further out. So watch what happens if I start choking this. The darkest part of the shadow moves further and further in. That actually looks more dimensional in this case. So the trick with all of these settings is play with them. Because all objects are different than each other, settings when you're working with little tiny type like this are going to be entirely different than if you were working with a gigantic object. Let me show you that right now. I'm going to click OK. Click on the object, and this object is a little unusual in that it has a white stroke around it. You can't see that paper white stroke because you're looking at white on a white background. But watch what happens when I go and select my object listing and go to my FX pop-up to inner shadow. I'm getting a shadow on the inside of the object. Let's have some fun with this. I'm going to leave everything exactly the way it is, except increase the size. So I'm making it more and more diffused. And it almost begins to look like a beveled mat. I think I went a little bit too far. Let me click the down arrow just once. I do want to increase the distance a bit. And now I'm just going to click OK. And that is really cool. It really does look like a beveled mat. Let me go into preview just to show you and scroll over a bit. So that is really a cool effect. What's really nice is you can apply multiple effects to different parts of an object, either the whole object, just the stroke, just the fill, just the text, or any combination of those parts of an object. So a lot you can do with effects. In upcoming lessons, we're going to continue discussing effects and transparency.